Welcome back to World Energy Television. I'm Doug Johnson. Open standards is effectively going from strict regulation across the board to almost no rules at all. Will it be a blessing for the energy industry or a harbinger of chaos? This edition of World Energy Technology's Leadership Series asks, are open standards an oxymoron? Our panel will tell us what they think a standard is, and we'll see if their definitions match. Please join me in welcoming our guests here in the studio. John Gibson, President and Chief Executive Officer of Paradigm, Shekhar Venkat of IDC Energy Insights, Dan Piette, President and Chief Executive Officer of Open Spirit, and Tom Halbooty, Chief Information Officer of Pioneer Natural Resources. Also linked into the studio are Mario Rivas from AMD, Matt Simmons of Simmons & Company International, and Bob Greco, who is the Upstream Group Director at the American Petroleum Institute. Open standards. Standards are great as long as they are your standards, right? Before we start discussing, let's get a working definition from everybody.
Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there are standards bodies to define what an open standard is. There's one in the U.S. called ANSI, and there's one in Europe called the EIF. But generally what they say is an open standard is a generally useful set of definitions that's maintained by a nonprofit body that takes input from the group that's being standardized, and it can be used at a nominal cost. So there isn't a punitive effect if you want to use these standards.
It's one of those buzzwords that comes out of several other industries where you, and I believe, and it probably means about 10 different things to 10 different people, but I've always assumed that what it meant, and if it's something else, then this is a good topic too, that you end up having a cookie cutter for when you say, we need a 10,000 pound PSI blow-up preventer, that you end up having a universal standard.
Shekhar, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of put a technology or an IT twist to the definition of open standards, and it's about understanding that you have context and you have a conduit, and it's about understanding that your context is your data that you're trying to get to, and a conduit is essentially allowing everyone else to get to that data and letting the whole world know what the protocol is to access context.
Well, I have a similar definition than Shekhar. I look at it from the same perspective, the IT industry. And to me, standards are the compatibility rules that allow us to exchange information freely. And it's very important that the format of the information follow a standard protocol so that the machine can then take the information, interpret it, and produce results.
Standards, in my opinion, are like a vocabulary or a language. They're something that everybody agrees on that you use to communicate between parties, and you know what you're talking about when you use the language.
John?
Standards are, to me, provide connectivity so that it gives people flexibility in how they pursue outcomes, but fundamentally all forms of standards have some form of connection.
Well, I've heard a lot of good definitions. Can't argue with them. I mean, API is one of the ANSI-accredited bodies that sets standards for the oil and gas industry. So I tend to defer to the first definition, but clearly it's an important mission for us and our members to help them develop such standards. So we would view ourselves as an open standard-setting body.
You know, usually it's market share and not some committee's decision that sets standards. Is there a body that can reach a consensus on standards that energy leaders all over the world can and will follow?
I really have a strong opinion about this because there's really two types of standards you're talking about here. There are what you might call de facto standards, or ones that everybody uses even though there's not an official definition. They may even be controlled by an individual company. Think back to Hayes modems with the AT command set. Everybody used those. And then there's the de jure standards, which are the ones set by API, by POSC, by those organizations. And these tend to be much more rigorous, much slower to change and address the market conditions.
Tom, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, my thoughts are that there probably isn't one group that can do this. I think what the industry does need, because we're in a different world now, we've moved from functional silos where a lot of the standards bodies in some respect stemmed out of a specific discipline focused on a specific area. But the way the world has moved, we're more in a process-oriented model where there are workflows that cross many, many boundaries. And there probably isn't one body to do that, but I think there is a challenge that can we bring these things together in some level of context that demystifies what standards do exist.
Matt?
I think, frankly, that's a good idea, but it's too utopian. That it's far more practical, and you can spend basically a decade struggling through committees to come up with the proper definition of oil. That's an interesting thing, is that the one definition I would strike from everyone's vocabulary and cut the next 10 tongues out is oil is just another commodity. I would basically say that you're thrown in jail for that, for abusive language. Oil is a scarce natural resource.
I think Matt has a very good point. We need to separate the academic exercise of defining a set of standards produced by a single body of presumably academicians versus the practicalities of life, where it is impossible to get all 100 people that have something to say about it to reach an agreement. That is the nature of man, to try to inject our own personality into the definitions. So the ideas are great. The practical implementations are far more difficult. Matt is right.
Shaker, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it kind of points back to what Dan had to say earlier about de facto and de jure standards. Fortunately, you have only 2 chip manufacturers, and if you look at the hardware solutions being built by IBM, Sun, SGI, NetApps, EMC, and other providers out there, they're able to standardize upon these chips built by the chip manufacturers. And I just wanted to point out that it's a fortunate environment to be in compared to the de jure software environment, where you have thousands of players building applications and application programming interfaces and no one getting anywhere.
Don't you think that the standard is somewhat created by the barriers to entry? In other words, the cost and capital expenditure to create a chip fab facility and the R&D that's associated with it is far greater than developing software applications.
Well, I mean, the cost of developing software is no longer trivial when we begin to look at developing enterprise-wide systems. Take SAP would be an excellent example of what's become a de facto standard for financial systems in the energy sector. And the complexity of integrating it with your business process, building on it for your corporation, makes it an almost impossible enterprise-wide solution to remove.
And I'd like to be devil's advocate here and say that if we truly did end up building standards from a software standpoint, then the revenue share of the IT services, which helps with systems integration, would go down significantly. So maybe there's a vested interest for vendors not to build standards, because guess what? Your service department would, probably make good revenues if there weren't standards, and they're the ones making a lot of money these days.
Some software companies' service departments certainly do make a lot of money, and I would hesitate to say that they actually write their software to make it difficult to install. That might be an urban legend, but
when you look at standards, though, we tend to lump everything together, and I think that's probably not the best way to look at it. We have some standards in our industry that are health, safety, and environmental related, where we have to have incredibly rigorous and robust certification methodologies in place on pressure vessels, on blowout preventers, etc.
Matt, which processes need the most work in your opinion?
It's easy. It's actually the all-encompassing word of everything.
But let's narrow the focus a bit.
Well, once again, Matt is probably right, and it is everything. But then we go back to his other statement that was also correct, where there is a reality that we have to face, where we should attack every angle, and the practicality of we cannot. So to me, the most important standard to set first is the standard for the information itself, because not able to exchange it, incompatible systems will produce higher cost in the industry, and that is really not a good thing. It's very important that the standard body or the standard group really come to consensus very quickly on what kind of format the information will have, and that would allow us quick dissemination of the information across the industry.